CGTN, China Global Television Network.
A spike of COVID-19 infections in recent weeks has rocked India, the world's single largest producer of the COVID-19 vaccine. And as India struggles to meet its domestic demand for vaccines, a ripple effect of global shortages has put a renewed spotlight on calls to temporarily waiver COVID vaccine patents and boost production globally. So calls for the patent waiver kicked off in October last year at the World Trade Organization. But 8 months down the line, there is little to show for it. Instead, sharp divisions continue to grow for and against calls for the waiver. Now, while key Western economies still enforce bans on COVID vaccine exports, the push for patent waivers recently received support from the United States. But how sincere is this support in the grand fight against COVID-19? Is a patent waiver the silver bullet in tackling this global pandemic? And what are the arguments for and against the waiver of patents? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The European Union and the United Kingdom are now being seen as among the few developed economies stopping a temporary waiver of COVID vaccine patents. Some countries in Europe argue that such a move would stifle innovation and research. But how does this argument weigh against the urgency to save lives in the midst of a pandemic? Tony Waterman brings us the perspective from Brussels.
Europe has long contended that suspending intellectual property rights, essentially giving away the internal secrets of how vaccines are made, could stifle innovation and wouldn't necessarily fix supply problems or speed up global vaccination like supporters of the proposal claim. Brussels feels that the only way to solve these issues is by expanding capacity, which it is trying to do internally. But with the U.S. now backing these patent waivers, Europe and the UK are now pretty much the only major developed economies standing in the way. And with that in mind, Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen said the EU is open to discussing all options on the table.
The European Union is also ready to discuss any proposal that address the crisis in an effective and pragmatic manner. And that's why we are ready to discuss how the US proposal for waiver on intellectual property protection for COVID vaccines could help achieve that objective.
The solution Brussels would ultimately like to see is the so-called third way, which has been promoted by the new WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Now, under this approach, vaccine manufacturing would be licensed to countries or companies based on multilateral rules, which supporters say would ensure adequate supplies while also protecting intellectual property. AstraZeneca already has this type of agreement in place with the Serum Institute of India. But pressure is certainly mounting. Of the 1.1 billion vaccine doses administered globally, just 0.3% have gone to low-income countries. The rest are being snatched up by rich nations, and that is not sitting well with a lot of people here in Europe. The French and Belgian governments have already signaled their support for these waivers. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
And to help give us a broader perspective on this subject, I'm now joined via Zoom by an expert panel of guests. Professor Akanmori is in Brazzaville. He's the Regional Advisor on Vaccine Regulation, Research and Development at the World Health Organization. Dr. Francis Mangeni is joining us from Lusaka. He's a fellow at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. Dr. Jeffrey Mphahlele is joining us from Pretoria. He's the Vice President for Research at the South Africa Medical Research Council. And Dr. Bharat Pankania is in Bath, UK. He's a Senior Clinical Lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School in Bath. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us on the program. Professor Mphahlele, South Africa is behind the push to have the patent waivers at the WTO. What was the thinking behind this?
Thanks for having me. You will recall that this would not be the first time that a waiver is requested. In the past, actually, a number of countries have put a request for a waiver forward, and their requests were acceded. So I think in this case, at the moment there's no consensus, but it appears to me that there is a move towards agreement to the waiver, because the waivers can only be considered under exceptional circumstances, and obviously COVID-19 is really an extraordinary circumstance.
Professor Akanmori, the World Health Organization must be looking at the developments with optimism, with pessimism. What is the thinking of the WHO?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think clearly the current consensus building which is happening globally is exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for consensus around waiving the IPs. We're asking that this be carefully considered, given the fact that we're in a pandemic, and one that has actually brought the world much closer together around vaccines than ever before. And I think that we need to take this even further by ensuring that the WTO brings everyone together, that this is guaranteed. But I think even more importantly, the steps which follow a waiver are critical. They're more critical. That of technology transfer, capacity building. And this is where the WHO comes in, because we can facilitate this, ensure that the technology is transferred to appropriate places where countries can fully utilize this, and we can have vaccines manufactured in multiple sites to help us address this dreadful disease and this pandemic.
Professor Akanmori, you talk about the technology being transferred, and we do know that the United States at this point is supporting the patent waiver. But when it comes to technology transfer, particularly to developing countries that may not have the capacity to produce the vaccines, is there a system for technology transfer that will be in place?
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's not entirely true to say there are no developing countries which are ready to manufacture vaccines. I think it's a matter of ensuring that all the pieces come together in a comprehensive plan, a plan that considers feasibility of the transfer, training elements, infrastructure, substantial investments, and a political commitment and will. And that is not lacking at all on our continent, because as you know, the heads of states have fully made commitments and are willing to boldly step into this area. And don't also forget that we already have a couple of countries on our continent which do make vaccines anyway.
So, Dr. Pakania, as the debate unfolds and as the discussions move along, French President Emmanuel Macron and most of the European Union leaders are saying that donations and lifting of bans on exports of vaccines and its components is probably a better approach to handling the current shortage in the lower income countries. How are countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, which has, I think, doses that can cover about 4 times its population, how are they responding in unveiling their surplus stocks? And what is your view on that question of patent waiver versus lifting of export bans?
With respect to managing the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to have a multifaceted approach. So we have a multifaceted approach to infection prevention, which is social distancing, wearing masks, getting immunized, keeping your space, hand washing, etc. Similarly, with regards to going forward and the vaccines issue, it has to be multifaceted, which is that you get your vaccines donated by either the World Health Organization or directly by countries such as the United States, European Union, UK, Canada, etc. Both of those are valid. Long term, we are going to need vaccines as booster doses. We're going to need vaccines as reformulations to be able to cover the variants that are emerging from India, Brazil, and other countries. Therefore, long term, I personally feel it is important that Africa and Asia and other countries are not dependent wholly on donations. I want them to be able to also manufacture, so that on the one hand, the donations are elastoplast, a stopgap, a help, but going forward many, many years, I want them to be able to manufacture. And by being able to manufacture, it is good for all of mankind. It isn't a case of we don't really need to manufacture it.
Dr. Mangeni, I want to explore that equitable manufacture and equitable access to ingredients a little bit more, because the US last week reversed its position and is now backing the call for a partial waiver for the COVID vaccine. However, the United States has also imposed curbs on the export of the raw materials needed to produce the vaccines, as India was asking for that. Isn't this doublespeak on the part of the United States? Isn't this vaccine nationalism? Is the United States, though, sincere in helping the world to end COVID-19?
Yeah, I think you can actually say that. However, maybe what we need to understand is that the US is going through a transition. We now have a new administration in place, which is trying to get on board, which is trying to say to the world that we are back. So I'm quite optimistic that we shall get there. But as the colleagues are emphasizing, we need a waiver of the intellectual property rights, including patents. But that's not all. We also need sharing of know-how, of trade secrets. Now, this is feasible. If you look around Africa, we have had installed capacity to actually manufacture some vaccines. We manufacture some vaccines. But we have also had, and this is what I'd like to really highlight, cases where companies, factories have started from scratch. If you look, for instance, at Quality Chemicals Limited, which is based in Kampala, just next to you there in Nairobi, they entered a joint venture with CIPLA of India, and they established a WHO pre-qualified facility for manufacturing retrovirus for HIV/AIDS, mosquito nets, anti-mosquito nets, and so on and so forth. So the point I'm making is that, yes, we need access to the ingredients, the trade secrets, the know-how, in addition to the wave of patents. But in addition to that, we also need the ability, the goodwill of these big companies to enter joint ventures with our installed industries on the ground in Africa. And then that can actually fast track the production of medicine. Now, that also will enable or facilitate equitable access, because when you manufacture medicine on the ground nearer the population, it's much easier for that population to access it. It's much easier to achieve universal distribution and universal vaccination. We know, for instance, the logistics of transporting vaccines from faraway places to remote villages in Africa is quite tough. We are bringing in, drones to help us, because we are challenged by, surface transport, roads are bad, and so on and so forth. But I think this can be improved further if we can have adequate supplies on the ground at the local level, which are backed through joint ventures, of course, with the involvement and support of international organizations, international partners like the WHO and all the partners who are cooperating under facilities like the COVAX. But remember also, if I can just mention this, make this one last point, that we have at the continental level other flanking initiatives, such as the online market called the Africa Medical Supplies Platform, AMSP.Africa, which has been a facility where manufacturers of equipment, therapeutics, diagnostics that we need to fight COVID on the continent have been able actually to supply to places where these things are required. And as we speak now, more than $200 million worth of trade has happened on this platform. It's a local homegrown initiative to help with access and equity regarding what's required to tackle this pandemic. Yeah, so we have got our own homegrown initiatives. which can help vaccine equity. We need to fight vaccine nationalism. And I think there's goodwill around the world against vaccine nationalism.
All right, gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment and continue with this discussion shortly. But for now, we'll take a short break, but do stay tuned. When we get back, we'll take a closer look at how the unfolding situation in India is affecting the battle against COVID-19 in Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the program. Our panel of experts is still with us, Professor Akanmori, Dr. Mangeni, Dr. Pakania, and Dr. Mphahlele are our analysts today. Let's continue with this discussion. Dr. Pakania, if the consensus is reached at the WTO, and if if it is approved, the waiver is approved at the WTO, what would be the earliest that the world would see the additional capacity coming from the waiver?
So it depends on which country and where. So there are countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh which can hit this issue running. So for them, it would be about 3 months because they've already got laboratory capacity. Other countries who have the capability but no laboratories and nothing set up would take longer. So for them, it is 6 months. However, this is still better than nothing. We cannot say because it will take 6 months, we don't do it. We have to take the donations from WHO, COVAX, direct donations, as well as set up plants, because we are in this for the long run.
All right. Dr. Mangeni, I want to get your thoughts on this because you mentioned this at the beginning of the program in terms of creating a delicate balance, because when you hear wealthy countries arguing along the lines of stifling research and innovation of pharmaceutical companies, how delicate is the balance? Give us an understanding of the impact a waiver would have on pharmaceuticals, on the financing, on investors. Weigh that against the global public health crisis.
Yes, I think this is the crux of the matter. Now, research has been done, and empirical research, interviews with the researchers, innovators, to ask what exactly motivates them. Is it just money that motivates people to invent things, people to discover cures? Is it just money? Now, the consensus has been for a very long time, and as one of the colleagues pointed out, as Africa, we have been fighting for access to medicines to protect our public health for a very long time. For instance, in 2001, 2003, 2005, when we actually got the TRIPS agreement amended to allow us access to medicine. We have been fighting for this. And the consensus that has been emerging is that it's not about money. It's not just about profit. People will invent things because it is innate in human nature. It's part of our curiosity, part of how we are wired, part of how we are made to invent things. So there's this myth that without profit, people will not invent things. That's a myth, really. So at the end of the day, what we need is to have this balance, you call it a delicate balance, that finances research. There's a difference between financing research and then simply seeking to make a killing out of what has been financed, even through taxpayers' money, through public funds.
Right.
Like for COVID, we used the public funds to come up with the vaccines that we have in a record time. So I think that this balance is the balance would be in terms of recognizing that you need to finance research, and public funds are critical for this, as well as private sector funds, but public funds are critical for this. And then secondly, to know that the advancements in science and in the arts are for the benefit of humankind at large. Extinction is not something we should forget about. There have been 5 extinctions.
Right.
The COVID pandemic is actually a hint, a wake-up call that humankind is always on the brink of extinction if we continue, shall I say, being foolish or being irresponsible. For instance, with regard to climate change and now with regard to public health. So we need to take care of our species as humankind by being responsible, by sharing the resources that we share, as that we got from God. Let's put it that way. Now, is it good business for these vaccine manufacturers to ensure that the rest of the world gets access to vaccines? Yes, because if people die out, where will the market be? Where will you sell your products? So I think it's better to have people vaccinated, and then the pharmaceutical companies will be able to sell these people who are alive other medicines that they will be manufacturing. It's not just the vaccines that they are producing as a sole product. They are producing lots and lots of products.
Let me find out. I'll find out from Professor Akanmori about these other medicines that are being produced, because India, one of the world's biggest suppliers of vaccines, is facing a COVID-19 vaccine crunch. And of course, many are going to be wondering what impact this is having for the many countries that are relying on the Indian-made vaccines, supplied particularly through the COVAX initiative for equitable access. What impact is it having on the COVAX facility?
Well, certainly, as you pointed out, this is having significant impact on the number of doses that were originally planned to be supplied through Serum Institute of India, no doubt. But, they're doing their best to try to address this. Obviously, it's not easy, and it's delayed some shipments of vaccines, particularly to Africa. But thank God that for now, we've been able to supply vaccines to nearly all the countries which need to receive their first tranches of vaccines. It's very, very important that we use this as a lesson, because clearly what is happening in India through this very significant, huge wave is impacting on everything, not just on vaccines against COVID-19, but it could also affect, manufacture and delivery of other life-saving vaccines and medicines that we need on our continent.
So, Professor Akanmori, when you talk about there is some delayed shipment from India as a result, of course, those in developing countries, and I will stay specifically here, those in Africa who've been waiting for the COVAX facility as a lifeline. I mean, what measures is the WHO putting in place or adapting to ensure that the COVAX facility is still supplying the vaccines to the various countries that really require them?
No, thank you very much. Very, very important question. And here there are a number of things which are happening. One is obviously that in the pipeline of vaccines which are available to the COVAX facility are other products, other manufacturers, other suppliers. And clearly, these are coming online and are ready to ship vaccines. And so shortly, there'll be vaccines from other sources. That's the good thing about the multiplicity of vaccines we have. Indeed, we've never been as fortunate as we are with respect to this pandemic, where for one disease, we have so many different platforms of vaccines against the same product, which works so effectively. So that's one thing that's happening and will help to address, this slow, down in access.
Right.
Obviously, the other thing is, of course, bilateral and donations directly to the COVAX facility, thanks to some of the European countries who are, donating vaccines to help fill the gap. So these are some of the measures which are in place to ensure that countries have access on our continent.
Professor Mphahlele, of course, as is being mentioned now by Professor Akanmori, a supply shortage in India is not only causing problems for COVID-19 vaccines, but also the manufacture of other generic drugs and medical components. What impact is this having on Africa's wider healthcare, not just COVID-19?
Sure. Clearly, this has got a very significant impact in terms of healthcare delivery in the region. Because as you can imagine, India is not just the largest producer of vaccines, but they are a significant player when it comes to other therapeutics and drugs. So if they do not supply these therapeutics and drugs, Africa is in trouble, and not just Africa, but many other developing countries. So clearly, it's got a negative impact in terms of managing patients, in terms of making sure that the healthcare service in Africa is looking after their own patients. So I think that is the most important and the immediate impact. The impact is having, and there's no doubt that is beyond Africa, because India is not just supplying these drugs to Africa, it's supplying the drugs and vaccines to many other developing countries.
Dr. Mangeni, I want to get your final thoughts here. Discussions ongoing at the WTO, patent waiver versus import, opening up the export of the vaccines. The pandemic is far from over. So where do we go from here? I'll start off with you, Dr. Mangeni, very briefly.
Yes, that's a very good question and a way to end. Yes, we have had in the past the experience of getting the TRIPS amendment on access to medicine for HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Unfortunately, that came with lots of conditions, which made that amendment practically useless. So now, or this time round, when we get this waiver, we must not have those kinds of conditions which render it of practical, of no practical use. So going forward, can we have all the avenues for getting vaccines available and open, whether through the COVAX facility that needs to be on stream, whether through the African Medical Supplies platform that needs to be on stream, as well as other methods of donations. But equally important is for us to develop our domestic manufacturing capacity for therapeutics, diagnostics, vaccines, and all other medical products as Africa. This is a wake-up call. We really cannot afford to have another pandemic like this. So we need to be prepared. I think preparedness is the catchword now.
Gentlemen, a very insightful debate indeed, and thank you all for joining us on the program. But that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. We'd like to thank our guests for their insights. Professor Bartholomew Akanmori in Brazzaville, Regional Advisor on Vaccine Regulation, Research and Development at the World Health Organization. Dr. Francis Mangeni in Lusaka, Zambia, Fellow at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. Dr. Jeffrey Mphahlele in Pretoria, South Africa, is the Vice President for Research at the South African Medical Research Council. And Dr. Bharat Pankania in Bath, UK, a Senior Clinical Lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. And thank you too for tuning in for this week's discussion. The conversation continues online through our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. See you again next week. From the team in Nairobi, I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.